Okay, with that being said, I'm going to introduce our very famous speaker today, Bill Meyer. And I have the pleasure of introducing someone most all of us know, our very own Boulder Rotary Club member, past Boulder Rotary Club president, Bill Meyer. Bill has been a member since 1997 and has recently, as he says, sorta retired. And one of his passion projects is history, and hopefully he will have more time to devote to research and writing. Today we will hear about the KINGDON twins and their experience in World War II. So please take it away, Bill Meyer.
Thank you, Sally. I've been Zooming like the rest of you for the past 8 months or so. So this is the first time I've tried to actually give a talk on Zoom. I'm used to pacing around and using a clicker and being a little more active. So bear with me today. Today's a little different than most of our programs because it's not an explanation of my organization or some project that I've been working on. It's more of a historical narrative about a period of time spanning 80 years with some pictures and other materials that I hope will make the story a bit more meaningful. Because we're doing it by Zoom, Fred and I have worked for the past couple of weeks to get it synchronized, and so I can't ad lib. If I do, Fred will get lost and kill me. So I'll try and channel my best Jim Williams storytelling ability, but bear with me if I don't live up to his standards. Fred, you ready to pull them up? For Veterans Day, I'd like to tell you the story of the KINGDON brothers. It's about some seldom discussed history of World War II and some of the individual heroism that went unrecognized for decades. The story begins in Monroe, a small town of about 1,000 in central Iowa. The U.S. was still a mostly rural country, with the majority of the population living on farms or in small towns. Monroe was home to Layla and Ray KINGDON and their twin sons, Keith and Kenny. The boys were Ray and Layla's only children, the center of their lives. When war hit Europe and Asia in the late 1930s, the American military was in pathetic shape, with less than 190,000 active duty servicemen. To get more manpower, Congress in July 1940 authorized the first peacetime draft in American history. When they held the draft lottery, Kenny's number was one of the first drawn. But the draft wasn't the only step taken to get ready for war. In October 1940, President Roosevelt began calling up roughly 1 million National Guardsmen for a year's training in Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. One of those National Guard units was the 34th Infantry Division, which was made up primarily of men from Western Iowa, plus some from South Dakota and Minnesota. When the 34th Division was called up in February 1941, it was under strength, and many of its members were unfit for service. In April 1941, Kenny was inducted and sent to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, to help bring the 34th up to strength. He was assigned to Company G, part of the 2nd Battalion of the 168th Infantry Regiment, a unit based in Centerville, Iowa, about 60 miles south of Monroe. In the summer of 1941, German and Japanese forces continued their march forward. President Roosevelt's controversial response was covered in an iconic article in Life magazine. Faced with the imminent loss of hundreds of thousands of troops, Congress in the summer of 1941, by a 1-vote margin, extended the tours of National Guard units for an additional year and a half, beyond the expiration of their original term of service. The Guardsmen were outraged, and some of the troops painted their barracks with the letters OHIO, acronym for the slogan, "Over the Hill in October." Faced with the potential of thousands of desertions, the War Department relented and began discharging National Guard troops in October 1941. In this environment, Keith was drafted in late October 1941 and sent to Camp Walters in central Texas for basic training. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, Americans were terrified at the prospect of Japanese or German invasion fleets approaching both coasts. Military planners rushed any available manpower to defend the coastlines. One such unit was the 27th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit drawn from upstate New York. Activated for federal service in October 1940, nearly 40% of its troops were discharged in October 1941 in response to the over-the-hill in October discontent. A week after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the remaining New Yorkers were sent from Alabama to Southern California to defend against an expected Japanese invasion. At the same time, Keith and 3,200 other draftees in training at Camp Walters were ordered to join the New Yorkers in California. Keith was assigned to Company I of the 106th Infantry Regiment, drawn mostly from the village of Mohawk in rural upstate New York. In early 1942, Kenny's unit was sent east to Fort Dix, New Jersey. 3 months later, they shipped out on the Cathay, a converted British passenger liner bound for Belfast, Northern Ireland. Because of the bitterness that existed between the Northern Irish and the British Army, the American Army was deployed to defend Northern Ireland. Kenny's 34th Division was the first American unit to land in Europe since World War I. While it's not well known, long before Pearl Harbor, American civilian technicians had spent months quietly building camps across Northern Ireland, preparing for this day. When Kenny and the rest of the troops arrived, they scattered across Northern Ireland to these pre-selected sites and began training. Back in California, Keith also boarded a ship and headed for a sleepy plantation town in Hawaii called Hilo. For the next 7 months, the New York National Guard patrolled tropical beaches of the Big Island against an expected Japanese invasion. Back in Northern Ireland, the Iowa National Guard was training for an invasion of northern France. General Eisenhower then changed his mind. While the remainder of the division stayed behind in Northern Ireland, Kenny's unit, the 168th Regiment, was quietly transported to Western Scotland for training in amphibious warfare, something the U.S. Army had never done before. The results were depressing. Due to the general purge of National Guard officers, the officers in Kenny's regiment had been changed 3 different times. Eisenhower saw a failure of leadership at the battalion and company level, but with the pending operation so close, corrections were impossible. The Iowa National Guard troops were going to war with green officers and minimal relevant training. In mid-October 1942, Kenny's unit joined roughly 72,000 Allied troops, loaded onto more than 300 ships, and headed out to sea. They weren't told where they were going. In early November, the fleet entered the Mediterranean, and Kenny and his unit finally learned they were headed for Algiers, part of the Allied invasion of North Africa. On November 8th, the National Guardsmen from Iowa, with a few days of amphibious training in Scotland, loaded on landing craft to attack Algerian beaches. Because Algeria was defended by troops loyal to the Vichy government in France, resistance was light. However, one of the units to see actual combat was Company G, the boys from Centerville, losing 2 killed in a brief but intense firefight with Moroccan troops. After the surrender of French troops, British and American forces moved eastward to Tunisia to attack Rommel's Africa Corps. Kenny's unit was moved forward to an isolated portion of the front near Sanaid Station, a motley Arab village in southern Tunisia. When they arrived late at night, an officer mistakenly led them into a no man's land in the middle of German defenses. For 10 hours, Kenny and the other Green Iowa troops fought for their lives in the Tunisian desert. The next morning, they spotted other elements of the 168th and sprinted across open ground to rejoin the regiment. Unit cohesion disappeared when German panzer tanks attacked, and many fled to the rear. Though order was restored and the objective retaken, the criticism of the Iowans was intense, with generals from Eisenhower on down doubting their willingness to fight. On January 30, Rommel's troops captured Faid Pass, a narrow passage into southern Tunisia, one of the main entrances in and out of the region. To block the American advance, American commanders sent Kenny's regiment to occupy 2 hills, flanking either side of the exit from the pass. The hill to the south was occupied by the 3rd Battalion with nearly 1,700 troops. The hill to the north was manned by 900 troops, the remnants of the 2nd Battalion, including Kenny's Company G. American planners thought that from these heights, the units could defeat any German forces coming out of Faid Pass. In reality, the two hills were too far apart. They couldn't support each other, leaving each hill on its own. At 6:30 a.m. on Valentine's Day, 1943, two panzer divisions with more than 200 tanks burst from the pass. On the North Hill, Kenny's unit was outnumbered roughly 4-1, with only small arms for defense. For 2 days, the Guardsmen held out, but at dusk on the second day, they were ordered to withdraw. At 10:30 p.m. on that night, the 2nd Battalion began the 9-mile retreat through German forces towards American lines. Kenny's Company G was the last to leave, bringing up the rear with orders to hold their positions until 11 p.m., firing their weapons to cover the sound of the other unit's evacuation. After a half hour, the retreating troops were detected. Machine gun fire ripped across the desert as American troops ran into German bivouac areas or patrols in the dark. Out of the 904 men in the 2nd Battalion at the beginning of the battle, 432 made it to American lines. Kenny was one of them. On the other hill, of the 1,700 men in the 3rd Battalion, only 3 escaped becoming either a casualty or captured. Some small towns in Iowa lost most of the boys in the equivalent of 2 high school graduating classes in a single day. Generational losses that still linger. For all military purposes, the 168th Regimental Combat Team, Iowa's finest, was obliterated at Faid Pass. After the Faid Pass disaster, Kenny's 34th Division was placed under the command of British General John Crocker, who held little affection for the Americans. In late March, Crocker ordered the Americans to capture Fonduk Pass. When the attack bogged down, Crocker blistered the American National Guard unit, and his criticism soon appeared in the American press. When he learned of the British plans to scuttle the 34th Division, General George Patton asked that it be transferred to his command. Crocker laughed and said, "Take them, they're yours." Returned to American command, the Iowans rejoined the forces pressing forward in Tunisia and began winning praise for their toughness and fighting ability. During a battle in late April, Kenny was injured when his Jeep overturned, and he remained with his unit for 5 days during the fighting before he finally was sent to the hospital for several days of treatment. On May 9, German forces in North Africa surrendered. During the Africa campaign, which began in Algiers 7 months earlier, Kenny's unit, Company G, suffered 108% casualties. Eventually, they were sent back west to around Algeria to get replacements and begin training for their next mission, the invasion of Italy. On the other side of the globe, Keith wrote his hometown pastor back in Monroe, describing the boredom and homesickness that were his biggest complaints. But elsewhere, events were moving forward. By 1943, the American strategy called for an island hopping campaign through the Central Pacific to destroy the Japanese Navy and establish bases for the bombing of Japan. While Keith and the National Guardsmen of the 27th Division were in Hawaii pulling garrison duty and doing rudimentary training, Marines were tasked to provide the elite fighting forces to carry out this advance. One problem quickly surfaced. There weren't enough Marines to do the job. To make up for this shortfall, Army and National Guard units were assigned to work under the command of Marine generals. The clash of cultures was unavoidable, as the Marines' attack psyche collided with the Army's emphasis on planning and casualty avoidance. Among the available units was Kenny's 27th Division, a patchwork of older National Guardsmen and young draftees, often led by inexperienced junior officers. In November 1943, the Americans invaded the Gilbert Islands under the command of Marine Major General Holland M. Smith. Smith was a known eccentric, frequently referred to as Howlin' Mad Smith. General Smith was not a fan of the National Guard, describing them as a fraternal organization with an unimpeachable reputation for annual balls, banquets, and ship-shaped summer camps. When a regiment of the 27th Division struggled to take a lightly defended objective, Smith was furious with his citizen soldiers, opining that he was very dissatisfied with the lack of offensive spirit. While Keith's unit wasn't involved, these events were the turning point in his life. Back in Europe, Kenny's 34th Division left Algeria headed for Italy. Though not part of the initial invasion force, they were landed at the port of Salerno a few days later. Battle-tested and renewed, Kenny's unit was thrown into the fight and headed north. The Germans' defensive line in Italy was along the Volturno River, which was in flood stage with all of its bridges destroyed. For several weeks, Kenny and his buddies fought their way north, crossing and recrossing the Volturno. To make matters worse, the ill-equipped soldiers endured weeks of icy rains that turned the region into quagmire mud. One day, stumbling in the mud, Kenny fell and lacerated his hands. Hospitalized for 2 weeks, his injuries were described as infection, bruises, and combat neglect. When he returned to his unit, he was promoted to sergeant and made a squad leader in Company G. Shortly after he returned, Kenny's regiment was assigned to capture the German strongpoint on Monte Pantano, a 3,300-foot-high mass of bare rock. The 1st Battalion led the attack, but after 2 days, they were pinned down near the crest of the mountain. On the evening of December 2, Company G was ordered to relieve the 1st Battalion. Kenny led his squad up the mountain during the night, but the following morning, 2 companies of German grenadiers launched a fierce counterattack. While other units fell back, Kenny and his squad fought through falling snow to hold their position at the top of the mountain. As the fighting entered its 2nd day, Kenny was hit, suffering severe, serious shrapnel wounds to his chest. Though the details of Kenny's evacuation weren't recorded, soldiers wounded on the top of the mountain often had to lie for hours without attention until darkness enabled medical aid men to evacuate them in a dangerous 4-hour carry under fire down a steep mountainside. Kenny finally reached a hospital where he remained hospitalized for 7 weeks. When he was released, he had spent more than a year fighting his way across North Africa and up the spine of Italy, been hospitalized 3 times, endured desert heat and numbing cold, and seen scores of his buddies killed in action. But the American Army was short of manpower, and Kenny wasn't sent home. Instead, 2 months after he was wounded on Monte Pantano, Kenny was assigned to the 51st Signal Battalion as a truck driver and motor messenger. Though nominally a non-combat role, the Signal Corps often found itself in firefights as the Fifth Army sprinted towards Rome. On the other side of the world, the war had become real for Keith. Nearly 2 years after landing in Hawaii, Keith was sent into combat on a collection of tiny islands known as Aniwetak Atoll. While the Marines assaulted the main island, the 27th Division was assigned to take a spit of land known as Aniwetak Island. Keith's unit was given the lightest duty, serving as a reserve while other elements of the division cleared a presumed handful of defenders. Though only a few hundred yards across, the eastern shore of Aniwetak Island was covered with an impenetrable band of heavy brush. Unbeknownst to the National Guardsmen, concealed in the tangle were at least double the number of Japanese troops estimated by American intelligence. After sitting in a hot, crowded transport ship for nearly a month, Keith and the rest of Company I loaded on a landing craft and headed for Aniwetak Island. After they landed, a lead unit faltered, and Company I was ordered to take over the attack. Instead of a couple hours of reserve duty, Keith found himself battling an entrenched Japanese fourth, hidden in heavy brush, fighting to the death. The National Guardsmen and draftees fought up the island for the next 24 hours until fatigue forced commanders to relieve Company I, pushing it back to the mop-up duty in the rear. Nightfall came, but repeated explosions from undetonated shells kept the exhausted men on edge. In the darkness, ill-trained citizen soldiers who had spent the prior 2 years on garrison duty in Hawaii fired and lobbed grenades at supposed Japanese infiltrators. The following morning, Company I counted 8 dead and others seriously wounded, primarily from friendly fire. Eventually, Marines were landed on the island, and by the 3rd day, Aniwetak was secured. American forces, primarily Keith's regiment, suffered 37 killed and 94 wounded. Of the Japanese garrison of about 800 men, only 23 survived. Howell and Mad Smith derided the performance of the 27th Division in Aniwetak, calling it infuriatingly slow. The next stepping stone was Saipan, a volcanic and limestone bastion, laced with caves and tunnels, defended by nearly 30,000 Japanese troops. Again, Marine General Holland Mad Smith commanded this operation, with 2 Marine divisions to lead the attack. The reserve force were the citizen soldiers of the 27th Division, led by a general named Ralph Smith, no relation. Holland Mad Smith did not hide his unhappiness, later remarking, "After my experience with the 27th, I was reluctant to use them again in the Marianas, but they were the only troops available and I had to take them." For weeks, Company I and other elements of the 106th Regiment languished on garrison duty on the Eniwetok Atoll. When they returned to Hawaii in mid-April 1944, they had missed most of the preparations and training for the Saipan invasion. That omission seemed minor, since Keith's unit, once again, was to be held in reserve within the 27th Division's larger reserve mission. In late May 1944, roughly a month after returning from Eniwetok, Keith's unit boarded transports and headed for Saipan. The Marines hit Saipan's southern beaches on June 15 and immediately confronted ferocious resistance. When the invasion stalled, the 27th Division was ordered ashore. As part of the division's reserve, Keith and his buddies sat for 2 days in the tropical sun, waiting orders while the battle raged. From Saipan's southern beaches, a valley led to the north, essentially bare dirt with a road passing through its heart. On either side were ridges honeycombed with caves. In those caves, the Japanese had concealed machine guns, mortars, artillery pieces, and anti-tank guns, pre-positioned to devastate the valley floor. On the afternoon of June 22, the Army General Ralph Smith met with his superior officer, Marine General Holland Smith. After voicing displeasure with the lack of progress by the National Guardsmen, Holland Mad Smith issued an order that has become a little known but controversial part of American military history. He ordered the 2 Marine divisions to attack along the high ground on the flanks. The Guardsmen and draftees of the 27th Division were ordered down the center of the valley, which later became known as Death Valley. The next day, Keith's regiment headed into the valley, with Keith's company kept in reserve. But the lead units were soon engulfed from fire from above, and the National Guardsmen dove for cover on the high ground flanking the road. While these troops battled to stay alive, Holland Mad Smith sent the following telegram to the 27th Division headquarters. "Commanding General is highly displeased with the failure of the 27th Division on June 23rd to launch its attack at K Hour and the lack of offensive action displayed by the division in its failure to advance and seize Objective 05 when opposed only by small arms and mortar fire. It is directed that immediate steps be taken to cause the 27th Division to advance and seize the objectives as ordered." The Army General, Ralph Smith, was embarrassed, and his unequivocal order passed down the chain of command. "Advance of 90 yards in 1.5 hours is most unsatisfactory. Start moving at once." Company I, the reserve company and the reserve regiment of the reserve division, was at the very bottom of the chain of command. Blistered by the ongoing invective from above, the commanders tapped 2 platoons of Company I to lead the attack down the dusty tabletop in the center of the valley. Among them was Keith KINGDON, a draftee from Monroe, Iowa, with 1 day of combat experience, who had been sent nearly 3 years earlier to fill out the ranks of this New York National Guard unit. What happened next was later chronicled by a military historian. The movement was executed swiftly, but the head of the column had not gone more than 100 yards when mortar, small arms, and machine gun fire began raking the line from end to end. By this time, the valley was one big cloud of dust from fire which had been placed upon it. Observers later stated that they had never seen Japanese fire sustained over such a long period of time in such volume. Among the many dead was Keith KINGDON. Eventually, Keith's buddies recovered his body, which was put in a nondescript burial ground and moved to the rear. Later, another soldier from Monroe wrote Ray and Layla about his visit to Keith's grave. Among his words were as follows: When I found the cross with Keith M. Kingdon on it, to pray was the first thing I thought of, and I was thankful that I had been able to be there. While Keith and the men of Company I lay in graves on a distant Pacific island, Howland Mad Smith continued to build his legend. He relieved Army General Ralph Smith of his command for failing to move more aggressively. When word of this inter-service squabble leaked out, unnamed Marine Corps sources were quoted in Time magazine. Although terrific artillery barrages were laid down in front of them, Ralph Smith's men froze in their foxholes. For days, these men who lacked confidence in their officers were held up by a handful of Japs in caves. Spurred by the death of the 5 Sullivan brothers from Cedar Falls, just up the road from Monroe, the military by 1944 had informally instituted a sole survivor policy meant to shield parents from the loss of an only remaining child in combat. Kenny was headed home. In early September, Kenny boarded the Lambert Cadwallader, a Liberty ship headed back to New York. When he got back to the U.S., he received a 21-day furlough and returned for a visit in Monroe. Kenny finished the war serving in a military police unit in Camp Howze, Texas, a prisoner of war camp for captured German soldiers. In June 1945, after VE Day, Kenny was discharged. Entering as a draftee in April 1941, he had served more than 4 years through the entirety of the war in Nazi Germany. Though only 5'3" tall and barely 120 pounds, he fought in, by the best of my count, nearly a dozen major battles in North Africa and Europe. He was hospitalized 3 times for combat-related injuries. When Kenny returned to civilian life, he went home to Monroe. A year later, he married a local girl, Mary Sheeler. He lived there for the rest of his life, working for the county, passing away in 1988. Though Kenny never spoke about Keith's death, it's likely that he never knew the full story of his brother's heroism. In the summer of 1944, when word of Keith's death reached Monroe, few details were known. His body lay in a sandy grave on a distant island, the story of his death lost in the innuendo coming from Marine and Army brass. In 1948, 7.5 years after he left Monroe, Keith's body was repatriated with hundreds of others as part of an American effort to retrieve bodies from distant graves. No one talked about the incredible bravery of a homesick, untested young draftee, part of a unit disparaged by its superiors for months, who stepped forward onto Death Valley that morning, knowing that he faced almost certain death. Like Kenny, Keith returned aboard a Liberty ship, the Edward M. Bow, which was the last Liberty ship ever built. Unlike his brother, Keith came home in a military coffin. Like thousands of other families, Ray and Leela were given a form by the U.S. government to request a marker for Keith's grave. Keith was laid to rest under that marker in the Monroe Silent City Cemetery with full military honors. 7 decades later, folks passing the grave might have noticed the name, but none knew his story. Today, 7 decades later, in a turnout on a mountainous Saipan highway, 7,000 miles away from Monroe, a marker titled Death in the Valley describes, in English and Japanese, the history that played out below more than 70 years ago. To the west, 26 granite panels sit on a hill containing the names of more than 5,200 American service personnel who died during the Saipan campaign. On the 20th panel is inscribed the name of Keith Kingdon. But there's a postscript. In 2012, my wife Jane and I visited Normandy. While we were at the cemetery on Omaha Beach, Jane mentioned that her Uncle Kenny's twin brother had died in combat about the same time as the Normandy invasion in 1944. We realized that none of us knew how Keith had died, including Jane's beloved aunt, Mary Sheeler Kingdon. Intrigued, I started digging. For Veterans Day 2015, I put together a 2-part series in a local Monroe paper telling Keith's story. When we talked to Aunt Mary, she asked me if I could find out more about Kenny's military service. She knew that he had served in the 34th Infantry Division in Europe, but he never spoke about his experiences, even with her. We started by getting Keith's service record from the National Archives. When the file came, it laid out the skeleton of the story I just told you. But with the file came an unexpected letter. It explained that Kenny had been awarded nearly a dozen medals that he had never collected, including the Purple Heart, the Combat Infantry Badge, and numerous others. Among those medals were 4 Bronze Stars, awarded for 4 separate acts of heroism, 3 while serving in the 34th Division in Algeria, Tunisia, and southern Italy, and a 4th in some action I have yet to unearth while he was serving with the 51st Signal Battalion. We don't know why Kenny never spoke about his experiences or asked for his medals. I suspect his twin's death and the loss of scores of close friends in North Africa and Italy may hold the clue. When we learned the remarkable details of Kenny's service, we arranged for the delivery of his medals and gave them to Aunt Mary. She died shortly thereafter. There were millions of men and women like the KINGDON brothers. One way or another, many of them came home on Liberty ships. Tens of thousands never made it home at all. So that's the story I wanted to tell you on Veterans Day. It's a story about 2 young men who weren't the sort of battlefield warriors that we see portrayed these days on television or in the movies. World War II was largely fought by a citizens' military, filled with men not particularly eager to fight, but who went where they were told and did what they were ordered. A soldier's story was often serendipitous, depending on the luck of the draw that landed a man in a particular unit or on a particular battleground. But Keith's and Kenny's stories also illustrate that many of those citizen soldiers, intentionally or not, were heroes in the truest sense, doing their jobs in the chaos of war so that this nation could continue. That's the real story of Veterans Day, a story we should never forget.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill. We've got a few questions, and if you've got a question, put it in the chat, and we will get to you. So the first question up is Chad Stam. Why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hey, Bill, that was fantastic. That was really great to hear that story. And in part, you already answered the first part of my question. How did you stumble upon the story? But at what moment did you know that it was more than just a couple of articles in a newspaper and that it was going to be something a lot bigger?
Well, certainly when I got into Keith's story, that was the first part, and I knew there was something that I wanted to talk about in that story. And then obviously when we really dug into the background on Kenny's story, I mean, Uncle Kenny, quite a guy. I was lucky enough to know him for 20 years, and to know what he went through was just made me decide I really need to get into this and start pulling it together.
Okay, thank you very much. Regarding research, Marlene has a question. Go ahead, Marlene.
Hi, Bill. It was interesting to hear you talk about North Africa and Italy, because I know that's exactly where my father was in World War II. But like Kenny, he would never talk about his military service. And so how do you go about getting those records? Can you find his deployment records?
You can get, this is where it gets complicated. I think in 1973, there was a fire in the records unit of the National Archives in St. Louis, and about 90% of U.S. Army military service files were destroyed.
Oh.
If you would go back and look at the picture of Kenny's file, you'll see it's singed around the edges. Luckily, his was one that was kept. Now, Keith's story, we didn't have a personnel file, but there are a lot of just military books and records that are out there that you can dig through. It takes years, literally. It's taken me 8 years to get to this point.
Yeah, because I don't even know what regiment he was in or anything.
there's actually a database maintained by the National Archives that lists all of the military personnel that served during World War II and their unit. And that gives you some insight. Then you can go to the websites related to that unit and you get more information and as I say, just dig and sometimes get lucky.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Our president, Sally, has a couple of questions. Go ahead, Sally.
Thank you, Bill. That was just an amazing story. It was really touching and perfect timing with Veterans Day. Thank you for sharing that with us. Do you know, is it still common practice for troops from a particular city to serve together, or do they try to split them up now so that people avoid such a large loss like you were talking about in a particular area? And my second question is, what is combat neglect? And I haven't heard of that. Can you share the symptoms with us?
Right. To answer the first question, National Guard units still serve together from the same region. So, for example, one of my nephews deployed to Afghanistan for a year with a National Guard unit from Wisconsin and served with people that he trained with for the prior several years. So that still is done in the National Guard. Obviously, the U.S. Army is hodgepodge. People are assigned to units without any attention being paid to where they came from. Combat neglect, I don't know. That's what his records said. I don't know what the medical diagnosis is for that, other than he had just been out in the elements for so long. They didn't have tents, they didn't have waterproof ponchos or anything. They were just out in the cold, icy rain for weeks trying to survive.
Okay, thank you very much. NCW, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Bill. That was amazing. It was really kind of like impacted me. It's like those movies like Private Ryan. But my question to you is, did you find any correspondence? And do you know if the brothers are writing to each other, to the parents?
I found only a couple of pieces, one of which I showed, which is a letter to the pastor back in Monroe. Ray and Leela KINGDON passed away long before I got started on this, and so we had no access to whatever files they may have had.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It was wonderful. Wonderful.
Okay, Cassidy has a question. Go ahead, Cassidy.
Hey, Bill. Thank you so much for sharing the story. And I have to tell you, I was completely thrown when he died. I just thought I thought they were both going to go home. So I'm very sorry to hear that. My question is kind of related to Nancy's. Like, you had some great pictures of the different places. Are those pictures of the twins, or are they pictures of the general area or the specifics? I'm just wondering how close you got.
Mostly, yeah. Mostly they're pictures of their unit. There are a few pictures of the twins, but again, of course, Keith, there was nothing in Keith's effects to that degree, and certainly Henny didn't retain any. But I was able to find pictures from their units, which at least showed the conditions they were in.
Okay, thank you. Now, Bill, I'm going to ask a silly question if I missed it, if you said it, but what's the next step for you in this story? You know, the book, what are the logistics, when it's going to be published, how do we get it? How do I get a signed copy from you for free? You know, all those important questions.
Well, all I would say is don't hold your breath. I've been working on this for 8 years, and I'm probably years away from getting it to publication. I'm still doing research. For example, I mentioned the 51st Signal Battalion. Kenny won a Bronze Star for something that happened there. I still haven't been able to figure out what that's for. So I'm going to keep working on it. 2 or 3 years, hopefully I'll get it put together. And when I do, I'll let everybody know. And if I'm still capable of signing my name, I'll give you a signed autographed copy.
Okay, great. That's very important. We've got a question from Peter Ewing. Peter, go right ahead.
Bill, I wonder, has there ever been any evaluation or comment or whatever on the performance and obvious bias of the Mad Marine General?
Oh, there have been congressional hearings and everything else about it. That being said, if you would go back to the picture, you'll see there's a Marine Corps facility in Hawaii named after him.
Oh,
so he was the type of leader that certain people liked because he moved forward when it perhaps wasn't wise to do, but he wasn't there. He was on a ship offshore.
yeah. Brave man.
Okay, next question is Marty Evans. Go ahead, Marty.
Thanks so much, Bill. We were at the World War II Museum in New Orleans, maybe about 1.5 years ago. And I'm just wondering, would you see this as a place that maybe eventually your story could go, because it really put such a face on the war and the family and the connection, and so beautifully done.
I hadn't thought about that. I have no pride of authorship. And so if it would be something that somewhere along the line, whether it's that museum or somebody else would care to pick up, I'm more than happy to share anything I've got.
Would you be willing for me to share it via a friend who has connection with that museum?
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. Well, Jim Radowski, you have something you'd like to say.
Yes, Bill, I'd like to thank you so very much for bringing this story to us today. You know, it was a very poignant and wonderful story. In a way, it's a story that could probably be told about hundreds of thousands of American families during the war that sacrificed so much, including the lives of young men and women. And I was touched by the sort of common man heroism, if you will, that was displayed by both men, by both brothers. And we really appreciate you sharing the story with us today. And I want to thank you by way of saying that 100 doses of polio vaccine will be donated to the Polio Plus campaign to help finally eradicate polio. And thank you again so much for sharing the story today. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you so much, Bill. It was wonderful. Thank you, Jim.